The banging on my door didn't sound like a knock. It sounded like a command. I was inside my 100-year-old Lakehouse workshop restoring my grandfather's radio when the noise tore through the silence like an order of eviction already decided. My hand stayed steady because 20 years disarming bombs teaches you that panic is just another trigger you refuse to touch. I powered down the soldering iron, wiped my palms, and walked toward the front door, knowing whoever was outside believed they already owned what stood behind it. When I opened the door, HOA Karen was already mid-sentence, as if politeness itself was beneath the authority she thought she carried. She didn't greet me, didn't introduce herself, and didn't ask who I was. She announced that I had 24 hours to vacate what she called community property. Her voice had that brittle superiority of someone used to people folding before they even question the script she hands them. I didn't answer immediately, and that silence seemed to offend her more than any insult could have. She waved a clipboard inches from my chest and declared that the structure behind me was an asset belonging to the HOA, and that I was a trespasser living on borrowed time. I just looked at her, 6'3", 220 pounds of calm she couldn't intimidate, and let the quiet stretch until it became a pressure she couldn't control. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? H.O. Karen's expression tightened the moment she realized I wasn't flinching, wasn't apologizing, and definitely wasn't stepping aside to let her walk in like she owned the air around my doorway. She repeated herself slower this time, like volume and repetition could somehow convert fiction into legal reality, insisting that the house behind me fell under the jurisdiction of her association, and that my continued presence here constituted unauthorized occupancy. The words were polished, rehearsed, and weaponized, the kind of language designed to scare people who don't read the fine print or question the authority behind the tone. I took the papers she shoved at me without resistance, not because I accepted them, but because evidence is always more valuable in your hands than in your opponent's theatrics. The notice was thick with threats, bold fonts, and aggressive deadlines, yet every line screamed insecurity to anyone trained to examine pressure instead of reacting to it. She watched my eyes scan the document, clearly expecting fear to surface the moment I realized she had invoked official-sounding language and a countdown clock. Instead, the only thing I felt was a slow, cold clarity settling into place. The same clarity that comes when you realize the device in front of you is complicated but poorly assembled. HOA. Karen mistook my calm for confusion and leaned in with a smirk that said she'd already rehearsed this victory in her head long before she ever set foot on my porch. She told me this shack had been tolerated as a historical curiosity for years, but now that I intended to live in it, I had become a liability to community standards and therefore subject to removal. Liability was the word she used, as if my existence on land my grandfather built with his own hands somehow threatened the visual symmetry of houses that didn't exist a century ago. My eyes caught a single reference buried in her document, a citation to a founding HOA map designation that triggered a memory so sharp it felt like stepping on a pressure plate. Map references weren't random to me, because my grandfather didn't just build this house. He surveyed the land around it, drew the original boundaries, and recorded them with the obsessive precision of a man who believed land should never be misrepresented. That one line told me everything I needed to know about how confident she was, and more importantly, how reckless that confidence might actually be. I lifted my gaze past her shoulder toward the shoreline, where the polished glass community center gleamed like a monument to authority, a structure that suddenly looked less like progress and more like a question waiting to be asked. HOA. Karen kept talking, escalating her tone as my silence continued, interpreting my restraint as weakness rather than calculation, and promising that the sheriff would return tomorrow to enforce her order if I failed to comply. She wanted a reaction, a raised voice, a defensive argument she could frame as non-compliance, but all she got was me folding the notice once, then again, until it became a compact square that fit neatly back into her waiting hand. Confusion flashed across her face, because the script in her mind didn't include quiet resistance. It only included compliance or panic, and I offered neither. I finally spoke, voice low and steady, telling her she had made a mistake so fundamental that she wouldn't understand it until it was far too late to correct. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. because certainty delivered calmly lands heavier than any shouted threat ever could. HOA. Karen stiffened, the smirk cracking just slightly, as if some instinct deep inside her realized she had triggered something she couldn't immediately see or control. I closed the door without slamming it, just a deliberate, final motion that cut off her authority from crossing my threshold, and locked it with the same calm precision I used when sealing a blast container. On the other side, I could hear her voice spike into a frustrated shriek, the sound of someone unused to being dismissed, unused to encountering a target that didn't follow the fear script she relied on. I leaned back against the door for a second, not out of exhaustion, but to let the full weight of what had just happened settle into a single, undeniable conclusion. HOA. Karen thought she had delivered an eviction notice, but what she had actually done was reveal a vulnerability in her own foundation. One careless reference that tied her authority to land she might never have legally verified. The workshop behind me still smelled of cedar, linseed oil, and soldered metal, the scent of continuity and history that existed long before her association ever wrote its first rule book. This house wasn't just a structure on a map. It was a fortress of memory, labor, and documented boundaries drawn by the very man who taught me that land is defended not with noise, but with proof. She believed tomorrow would bring enforcement, compliance, and quiet submission. Yet all I could see was a countdown not to my removal, but to the moment her certainty would collide with records she never bothered to read. The war didn't begin with shouting or threats. It began with that single misstep on my porch, that one assumption delivered as fact, that one belief that intimidation could override documented reality. HOA. Karen walked away thinking she held the detonator, unaware that she had just stepped onto the device herself, and I already knew exactly which wire would end her authority the moment I chose to cut it. I didn't go back to the workshop to keep working on the radio. I went back because that room held the only truth that mattered more than any notice HOA Karen could wave in my face. The drafting table stood exactly where my grandfather left it, a scarred block of oak and steel that had witnessed a lifetime of measured lines, careful calculations, and decisions that outlived the men who made them. This house wasn't just bought, restored, or inherited in the casual sense people like Karen love to pretend property works. It was built from trees cut on this land, mapped by the same hands that placed the foundation, and defended by a philosophy that never allowed noise to replace documentation. My grandfather, Robert Hayes, wasn't just some nostalgic figure I referenced for emotional leverage. He was a combat engineer who crossed war-torn terrain building bridges strong enough to carry armies and precise enough to hold under pressure. When he came home, he didn't chase politics, didn't build corporations, and didn't beg approval from committees. He measured land, surveyed boundaries, and wrote records in ink that never depended on popularity to stay valid. This workshop was where he translated chaos into lines that courts would recognize decades later, and every tool hanging on the wall carried the quiet authority of someone who believed facts don't raise their voices because they never need to. I stood there, staring at the drafting instruments, the leather-bound journals, the folded survey maps, and I felt something shift that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with alignment. Because Karen's threat wasn't just an insult to me, it was an attempt to overwrite a record that had existed longer than her association's entire rule book. People like her rely on assumption, on the belief that time erases origins, and that whoever speaks loudest today can redefine what was drawn in silence a century ago. But land doesn't care about meetings, bylaws, or committees that came later. It recognizes only what was measured, filed, and proven before anyone else decided to build a narrative on top of it. My grandfather's journals weren't sentimental relics. They were operational logs, precise entries noting tree lines, shoreline markers, iron rods set into the earth as boundary witnesses, and meets and bounds descriptions that described ownership not in vague lot numbers, but in distances that could be retraced by anyone willing to do the work. Karen saw a quiet veteran living alone in an old house, and assumed she was dealing with someone disconnected from the paperwork that legitimizes property, but she didn't understand that my entire professional life had revolved around reading complex systems where a single overlooked line could determine whether something detonated or was safely dismantled. For 20 years, I wasn't just any soldier. I was explosive ordnance disposal, the person they called when the threat wasn't obvious, when the device looked stable on the surface but was wired with hidden triggers designed to punish careless assumptions. That training doesn't switch off when you come home. It rewires how you interpret every confrontation, every document, every claim of authority presented without substantiation. When Karen shoved that eviction notice toward me, she expected an emotional reaction, a raised voice or desperate defense. But what she actually triggered was a procedural instinct that told me to slow down, read everything, and locate the pressure plate she had unknowingly stepped on. My military career didn't just teach me to stay calm under pressure. It taught me that the loudest threat is often the one most desperate to hide its weakest connection point, because real authority doesn't need theatrics to enforce itself. After leaving active duty, the Army funded my postgraduate education in forensic engineering, a field built entirely on reconstructing events from physical evidence and understanding how structures fail when a single foundational assumption proves false. That discipline sharpened the instincts I already had, giving me the technical language to explain what I intuitively sensed. Systems collapse, not because of dramatic attacks, but because someone trusted a flawed premise and built layer after layer on top of it until the error became catastrophic. Standing in that workshop, surrounded by my grandfather's meticulous records, I understood that Karen's confidence likely rested on exactly that kind of premise, an assumption that the land her HOA governed had been fully verified at every stage of its development. She believed she was enforcing rules against a non-compliant resident, but the reality forming in my mind suggested she might be defending authority built on a chain of paperwork she had never personally traced back to its origin. I opened the safe my grandfather embedded into the stone foundation decades ago, the heavy door moving with the quiet certainty of something designed to last longer than passing disputes. Inside were the journals, the original deed, and survey maps drawn on thick linen paper that had survived floods, storms, and bureaucratic indifference without losing their clarity. I pulled them out carefully, not because they were fragile, but because they represented something Karen's notice lacked: continuity, documentation, and a lineage of ownership that predated every house, road, and decorative guideline her association now enforced. As I unrolled the maps on the drafting table, I didn't feel rage. I felt focus. The same narrowing of attention that happens when you're kneeling over a device, and you know the difference between guessing and verifying is the difference between disaster and control. My grandfather's handwriting marked natural landmarks that still existed: the bend in the shoreline, the old oak at the northern edge, the iron rod hammered deep near the creek where he established the first measurable boundary line. Those weren't abstract references. They were coordinates embedded in reality, waiting for anyone patient enough to correlate them with the present landscape, rather than trusting whatever simplified map an HOA printed for convenience. Karen's entire authority over this neighborhood might have been built on perfectly legal transactions, layered on top of one original assumption about ownership that no one in her position ever questioned, because the paperwork appeared complete enough to satisfy routine review. But routine review isn't the same as forensic verification, and I had spent years trained to spot the difference between documents that looked legitimate and documents that were actually rooted in verified origin points. My grandfather left me one line in his will that always sounded simple, until moments like this forced me to understand its full weight. The land is the only thing that lasts. Defend it. That sentence wasn't about aggression or stubborn pride. It was about responsibility, about recognizing that land records outlive personalities, committees, and every temporary authority figure who believes their role gives them the right to redefine what was settled long before they arrived. Karen thought she was confronting a quiet homeowner who would either comply or lawyer up in predictable ways. But she didn't realize she had confronted someone trained to treat every claim like a potential device, to trace its wiring back to the first connection point and verify whether it was ever legitimately anchored. I wasn't interested in arguing with her on the porch, debating rules she could recite louder than I could explain history, because the real confrontation would never be decided by volume. It would be decided by records that either aligned with reality or exposed the exact moment someone assumed alignment without verifying it. The more I studied the maps and journals, the clearer it became that my role in this conflict wasn't reactive, it was investigative, and that meant the next steps wouldn't involve shouting matches or desperate legal maneuvers, but a methodical reconstruction of the property's lineage from the moment my grandfather first measured it to the moment Karen's association claimed jurisdiction over it. Authority, real authority, isn't granted by a title or a clipboard. It's built from documented continuity that survives scrutiny, even when challenged by people convinced their position makes them untouchable. In that quiet workshop, with the lake visible through the window and the smell of cedar lingering in the air, I realized Karen hadn't just threatened my home. She had activated the exact skill set my entire life had been preparing me to use. And the worst mistake she made wasn't underestimating my willingness to fight. It was underestimating how precisely I would dismantle every unsupported assumption she relied on. The moment I finished reviewing my grandfather's maps, the conflict stopped being about a single eviction notice and started looking like a machine that had been running unchecked for years. A system designed to look legitimate on the surface while quietly feeding onto the people least equipped to resist it. I knew from experience that no authority like HOA Karen's operates in isolation, because power that aggressive always requires reinforcement, silent agreements, and a structure that shields it from casual challenge. So instead of reacting emotionally, I shifted into reconnaissance mode, the same mental framework I used overseas when I needed to understand not just the device in front of me, but the entire network that enabled its placement. The first step wasn't confrontation. It was observation, mapping the personalities, roles, and incentives that allowed Karen to behave with the kind of absolute certainty that suggested she'd never been seriously challenged before. From my porch, I could see the shoreline dotted with houses that looked perfectly maintained, manicured lawns, uniform fences, everything curated to project harmony. But harmony enforced through fear is never real stability. It's just silence waiting for the first credible disruption. Over the next few days, I paid attention to patterns instead of appearances, who deferred to Karen during casual interactions, who avoided eye contact when she drove by, and which homes showed subtle signs of pressure, like fresh compliance notices taped discreetly near mailboxes. The structure revealed itself slowly, not through dramatic revelations, but through consistent, small signals that all pointed to one reality. Karen wasn't just an overbearing neighbor. She was the center of a hierarchy that governed this entire lakeside development with a mix of bureaucracy and intimidation. Her husband handled financial approvals as the HOA treasurer, a detail that on paper looked routine, but in practice meant every fine, every maintenance contract, every landscaping invoice ultimately passed through a family-controlled decision point before becoming an official expense. The landscaping company servicing most of the neighborhood carried the same last name as Karen's extended relatives, and while that alone didn't prove wrongdoing, it suggested a closed loop where HOA funds circulated within a network aligned with her interests. Residents paid dues believing they were contributing to shared upkeep, but the consistency of certain vendors, the lack of transparent bidding, and the quiet complaints I overheard during walks told me the system functioned more like a private pipeline than a neutral administrative body. The real enforcement arm, however, wasn't financial. It was psychological, because Karen had cultivated a reputation that made people comply before disputes even escalated. I learned that homeowners who questioned minor fines often received follow-up notices citing additional violations, escalating pressure until challenging the HOA became more exhausting than just paying and moving on. That tactic mirrored classic coercive structures, where authority doesn't rely on overt force, but on creating enough friction that resistance feels pointless. And once I recognized that pattern, it confirmed this wasn't a single personality issue, but a coordinated method of control. The most disturbing confirmation came when I finally met Maria, the Marine's widow living a few houses down, whose story transformed my strategic curiosity into something far more personal and uncompromising. Her husband had served 3 decades in uniform, and when illness confined him to a wheelchair, she installed a ramp so he could still access the porch where he loved watching the lake, a modification any reasonable community would consider an obvious necessity rather than an aesthetic violation. Karen's HOA, however, issued a series of fines labeling the ramp an unauthorized structural alteration that disrupted visual harmony. And each time Maria tried to explain the medical necessity, the fines escalated instead of being waived. By the time her husband passed away, the accumulated penalties had grown into a lean, threatening foreclosure, effectively turning grief and vulnerability into leverage used to enforce compliance. Listening to her recount the timeline, I didn't hear just isolated incidents. I heard a consistent escalation model where initial citations created a paper trail, and each additional notice reinforced the idea that the HOA's authority was absolute and non-negotiable. That strategy works on people who feel alone, people who assume challenging the HOA means facing the entire neighborhood and local bureaucracy without allies. And Karen clearly relied on that isolation to maintain control. Once I understood how Maria had been pressured, I began connecting it to the broader structure, realizing the HOA didn't just enforce guidelines, it curated compliance through a cycle of minor violations, financial penalties, and implied threats of legal action that most residents lacked the time or resources to contest. The political dimension became evident when I noticed how quickly county inspectors responded to complaints that originated from HOA leadership, often arriving within days to cite residents who had recently pushed back against Karen's decisions. That level of responsiveness suggested a relationship beyond routine administrative coordination, because typical municipal processes rarely moved that efficiently unless there was consistent advocacy from someone with influence. Rumors circulated quietly among residents about campaign donations linked to HOA-associated contractors, about local officials who attended association events and publicly praised Karen's leadership, creating an image of alignment between private governance and public authority. None of this alone proved corruption, but together it illustrated a feedback loop where Karen's power was reinforced by institutional familiarity and the perception that challenging her meant confronting not just a board, but an entire interconnected system. The more I mapped these relationships mentally, the clearer the machine became. Residents paid dues that funded vendors connected to HOA leadership. Those vendors maintained the neighborhood's curated appearance. That appearance justified strict enforcement, and strict enforcement discouraged dissent, allowing the financial and social structure to operate without sustained scrutiny. Karen didn't need to threaten people openly, because the system itself created consequences for anyone who resisted, from increased inspections to prolonged disputes that drained time and energy. That realization hardened my approach, because dismantling a machine like this requires precision, not impulsive confrontation, that could be framed as personal vendetta rather than structural challenge. I knew if I accused her prematurely without documentation, she'd shift the narrative instantly, portraying me as a disgruntled homeowner, unwilling to follow community rules, and that framing would allow the entire power structure to close ranks around her. Instead, I focused on documenting patterns, noting dates when certain notices appeared, observing which contractors were repeatedly approved without competitive bids, and correlating those observations with the financial roles within the HOA hierarchy. The picture that formed wasn't a chaotic abuse of power, but an organized ecosystem where authority, money, and enforcement reinforced each other in a cycle that looked lawful on the surface, yet felt predatory when viewed through the lens of impact on vulnerable residents. Maria's case was the clearest example, but conversations with other homeowners revealed similar stories. Smaller fines over mailbox paint shades, lawn height discrepancies, or decorative flags deemed non-compliant. Each incident minor in isolation, but collectively creating a climate where the HOA's preferences became indistinguishable from binding law in the minds of those subject to them. Karen's greatest strength wasn't just her position as president. It was the normalization of her authority, the way people began to treat her directives as inevitable rather than contestable, because no one had ever presented a credible, documented challenge that exposed the underlying assumptions supporting her control. By the time I finished piecing together these dynamics, the conflict had evolved in my mind from a personal eviction dispute into a broader exposure of how unchecked governance structures can drift from community stewardship into quiet exploitation when no one with the right combination of patience, training, and documentation steps in to question them. Karen believed she was enforcing harmony, but what she was actually preserving was a system that benefited from unquestioned authority and consistent financial flow, and she had just picked the one person in the neighborhood trained to examine systems not by their stated purpose, but by their operational incentives. The abuse wasn't always loud, it wasn't always cruel in obvious ways, but it was persistent, calculated, and embedded in procedures that looked neutral until you followed the consequences to the people most affected. Once I saw that clearly, the stakes changed permanently, because defending my land was no longer just about personal ownership. It became about dismantling a structure that thrived on the assumption that no one would ever trace its power back to the fragile premises it depended on to survive. The moment the full shape of the HOA's power structure became clear in my mind, the conflict stopped being about personalities and transformed into a forensic reconstruction of facts, because intimidation only survives as long as documentation remains unchallenged. I returned to the workshop not to calm down, but to begin the methodical process of converting suspicion into irrefutable proof, the same disciplined progression I had followed countless times when dismantling devices that looked stable until every wire was traced back to its origin. My grandfather's deed lay folded in the safe like a quiet witness waiting to be called, and when I pulled it out, the weight of that linen paper felt heavier than any eviction notice Karen could ever produce. The language was archaic, filled with meets and bounds descriptions referencing iron rods, shoreline bends, and landmark trees, but archaic did not mean obsolete. It meant foundational, a legal blueprint describing land ownership in terms that could be retraced with modern tools if someone cared enough to verify them properly. I unrolled the survey maps on the drafting table and began translating the century-old measurements into present-day coordinates, overlaying them mentally against the development layout I had observed during my walks around the neighborhood. Each line drawn by my grandfather corresponded to a physical marker that still existed in some form: the slight curve in the shoreline, the old oak tree near the northern bend, and the rust-stained patch of earth where an iron rod had once marked a definitive boundary. The more I compared those original lines to the modern parcel divisions enforced by the HOA, the more one realization crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. The community Karen governed appeared to sit squarely within land that had once been recorded as part of my grandfather's surveyed tract. That didn't automatically invalidate decades of subsequent transactions, but it did introduce a fundamental question that Karen's absolute confidence had never seemed to acknowledge: whether every step transferring ownership from that original deed forward had been executed with complete procedural and ethical accuracy. To move beyond speculation, I needed records beyond what sat in my workshop, so I drove to the county records office, a place where the smell of old paper and dust carried more legal weight than any modern HOA meeting ever could. I requested archived property filings related to the original development, framing my interest as historical research, because the truth rarely announces itself to people who approach it like an accusation rather than an inquiry. Hours passed as I combed through microfilm and digitized indices until I located the quiet title action filed decades earlier, the legal mechanism used to consolidate parcels for the eventual construction of Lakeview Estates. On its surface, the filing looked routine, citing abandoned land and referencing notification procedures that satisfied minimum statutory requirements at the time. But as I read more closely, the weakness revealed itself not in what the document said, but in what it assumed that publication of a notice in a small, local newspaper constituted adequate effort to inform any potential heirs of the original owner. My grandfather had passed away years before that filing, and if no direct search for heirs had been conducted beyond that limited publication, the process may have met the letter of the law while still leaving a procedural gap large enough to invite legitimate challenge under modern scrutiny. That discovery didn't immediately overturn anything, but it reframed Karen's authority from unquestionable fact to a claim built on a historical process that might not withstand detailed examination if someone actually forced the issue. I requested certified copies of the filing and supporting documents, not as ammunition for confrontation, but as components of a factual timeline that could demonstrate how the land's title lineage evolved from the original deed to the present governance structure. Back at home, I spread those records beside my grandfather's maps and began constructing a chronological sequence, each transaction, subdivision, and administrative approval forming links in a chain that either aligned seamlessly or revealed moments where assumptions replaced thorough verification. The further I traced that chain, the more apparent it became that while later buyers had likely acted in good faith, relying on the apparent validity of consolidated titles, the original consolidation itself rested on notification methods that could be scrutinized if examined under contemporary standards, emphasizing diligent search for heirs rather than minimal publication. This was not a trivial technicality, because authority over land ultimately flows from the legitimacy of its earliest recorded ownership and the transparency of its transfer across generations. Karen's confidence relied on the perception that the HOA's jurisdiction was an unquestioned reality, yet reality in property law is not defined by repetition, but by documentation capable of surviving formal review. I then turned my attention to the gleaming community center by the shoreline, the physical symbol of HOA authority, and began researching its funding sources, because large developments rarely materialize without public grants or municipal incentives that require strict certification of land ownership before funds are approved. Public spending databases revealed that the project had indeed received development funding tied to community infrastructure improvements, and while that didn't automatically indicate wrongdoing, it meant that at some point Karen or her predecessors had formally affirmed clear title to the land when applying for those resources. If that affirmation relied on a title lineage containing a potentially vulnerable, quiet title action, then the issue extended beyond neighborhood politics into compliance with broader regulatory standards governing public funds and property certifications. I documented every reference number, every grant description, and every certification requirement, building a cross-referenced matrix that linked the HOA's modern authority to historical filings and financial affirmations that could not simply be brushed aside as internal matters. At this stage, the process became less about emotion and more about precision, converting each suspicion into a documented element that could be independently verified by anyone with access to the same records. Maria's foreclosure notice was placed at the top of the evidence stack, not because it was legally central, but because it illustrated the real-world consequences of authority exercised without full awareness of the structural vulnerabilities supporting it. If Karen's power to fine, lien, and threaten eviction ultimately traced back to a title consolidation process with procedural weaknesses, then every enforcement action carried out under that authority existed within a legal context more fragile than she ever imagined. I wasn't claiming immediate ownership over the entire development. That would have been reckless and unsupported at that stage, but I was establishing a credible basis to question whether the jurisdiction she invoked so confidently was as unassailable as she believed. I scanned all documents, digitized the maps, and created layered overlays comparing historical boundaries with current parcel lines, ensuring that every visual representation of the issue could be understood not as abstract argument but as measurable spatial reality. The resulting composite image was stark, showing the original shoreline tract enveloping sections of the present-day development in ways that demanded formal clarification rather than blind acceptance of long-standing assumptions. That image alone didn't win any case, but it served as a powerful visual anchor tying together decades of paperwork into a single coherent question. Had the foundational transfer of land been executed with diligence sufficient to extinguish all prior claims, or had it relied on procedural minimalism that no one in Karen's generation ever revisited because the system functioned smoothly enough to avoid scrutiny? I knew from experience that exposing a system's weak premise is not about shouting accusations, but about presenting a timeline so complete and consistent that the only rational response is to acknowledge the need for deeper review. Every record I collected, every overlay I constructed, and every cross-reference I documented transformed Karen's eviction notice from a symbol of authority into a trigger that initiated a comprehensive examination of how that authority came to exist in the first place. By the time I finished organizing the evidence, the conflict no longer felt like a neighborhood dispute. It felt like the opening stage of a formal reckoning between assumption and documentation, between a structure built on decades of unquestioned practice and the original deed that still sat quietly on my grandfather's drafting table, unchanged, patient, and waiting for someone to finally compare its lines to the reality everyone else had simply accepted without question. The day Karen returned with the sheriff's cruiser rolling slowly behind her, she expected spectacle, compliance, and a quiet removal that would reinforce her dominance over the neighborhood she had trained to fear her directives. But what she encountered instead was a wall of documented certainty she had no rehearsed response for. I stepped onto the porch before she could bang again, holding nothing but the same calmness the first time, and the deputies paused immediately, because authority looks very different when the person being ordered around shows no signs of panic or desperation. Karen spoke first, her tone sharpened by the presence of law enforcement she believed would transform her claim into immediate action, announcing that she had returned to enforce the eviction and that continued refusal to vacate would now involve official removal under the association's authority. The deputies glanced at me, then at the house, clearly expecting either defiance or negotiation, but instead I handed them a neatly organized folder containing certified copies of the deed, survey overlays, and the archived quiet title filing that raised legitimate questions about the foundational lineage of the land itself. I didn't accuse, didn't threaten, didn't even raise my voice. I simply asked whether they were prepared to enforce a private association's eviction order, while a documented ownership dispute involving historical filings and boundary verification remained unresolved. That single question shifted the energy on my porch instantly, because law enforcement operates on clear authority, and the moment that authority appears contested through legitimate documentation, caution replaces routine compliance. Karen tried to interrupt, insisting that the HOA's jurisdiction had been established for decades and that my paperwork was irrelevant to the association's current authority. But the deputy's hesitation betrayed the fact that her certainty alone was no longer enough to compel immediate enforcement. They asked procedural questions: who had verified the current title, whether any formal court determination existed regarding the boundaries shown in my documents, and Karen's answers grew less confident with each inquiry because she had never expected to justify her authority beyond repeating that it existed. When the deputies ultimately stepped back and advised that the matter appeared to involve a civil dispute requiring formal resolution rather than immediate eviction, Karen's composure cracked for the first time in public, the veneer of absolute control slipping just enough for the watching neighbors to notice. She turned on them, voice rising, accusing them of refusing to do their duty, but they responded with professional restraint, explaining that enforcement without clear uncontested ownership could expose the county to liability if later review determined the eviction had been premature. The cruiser left slowly, not as a dramatic victory, but as a procedural withdrawal, and that quiet departure landed heavier than any shouting match could have, because it showed every resident watching that Karen's power was not as unilateral as she had always portrayed it. News of the confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood, not because I broadcast it, but because people had been conditioned to monitor Karen's enforcement actions closely, and this time they saw her authority meet resistance grounded in documentation rather than emotion. Within days, questions surfaced during HOA meetings about transparency in land records, about the historical basis for jurisdiction, and about whether enforcement actions carried legal risks if foundational ownership claims were ever challenged formally. Karen attempted to regain control by framing me as a disruptive outsider exploiting technicalities, but the narrative she relied on began to unravel as more residents quietly reviewed their own closing documents and realized how little attention anyone had paid to the original consolidation process decades earlier. The breaking point came during an emergency HOA meeting held in the glass-walled community center, a setting Karen had always used as a stage for asserting control, where she opened with a speech emphasizing unity and dismissing the ownership questions as baseless distractions. I attended not as an aggressor, but as a documented claimant observing proceedings directly affecting the land lineage I had traced so carefully, and the room's tension shifted the moment she saw me take a seat. Calmly among the residents she expected to rally behind her, she reiterated that the HOA's authority was settled history, that decades of operation validated its jurisdiction regardless of any ancient deed. But before she could complete that assertion, representatives from an external oversight office quietly requested to speak with her regarding grant certifications tied to the community center's construction. The request was polite, procedural, and devastating in its implications, because it signaled that the issue had extended beyond neighborhood politics into formal compliance review connected to public funding requirements. Karen tried to dismiss the inquiry as routine, but the residents' faces told a different story. The realization dawning that the dispute was no longer confined to one stubborn homeowner, but had triggered institutional scrutiny capable of examining every document underlying the HOA's authority. Questions followed rapidly, about financial disclosures, about vendor relationships, about the precise boundaries used when certifying land ownership during development applications, and Karen's answers grew increasingly cautious as she attempted to maintain composure while deflecting specifics she had never personally verified. The meeting dissolved into uneasy silence rather than decisive resolution, and that silence marked the true collapse of her public dominance, because power built on unquestioned assumption cannot survive once the community begins openly questioning the legitimacy of the premises supporting it. In the days that followed, requests for documentation multiplied. Residents demanded access to financial records. County officials initiated administrative reviews of archived filings, and Karen's once unchallenged directives transformed into carefully worded statements emphasizing cooperation with ongoing evaluations. She was still president, still nominally in control, but the aura of inevitability that once surrounded her decisions had evaporated, replaced by a cautious defensiveness born from the awareness that every claim she made could now be cross-checked against historical records and regulatory requirements. What looked from the outside like a single homeowner resisting eviction had evolved into a public unraveling of the authority structure Karen had relied on for years, and she could no longer portray the situation as simple non-compliance, when every step she took now intersected with documented questions about the very land she claimed to govern. The collapse was not explosive. It was procedural, methodical, and humiliating in a way shouting never could be, because it forced her to operate under scrutiny. She could not intimidate away, revealing that her greatest vulnerability was not a lack of confidence, but a lack of verified certainty about the foundations supporting her rule. Once Karen's public authority fractured under scrutiny, the conflict entered its most controlled and consequential phase, the stage where emotional reactions would only dilute the precision required to dismantle a structure built on layered assumptions rather than verified continuity. I didn't celebrate the deputy's hesitation or the meeting's tension, because those moments were only indicators, not conclusions, and real resolution in disputes involving land and governance never comes from spectacle. It comes from methodical escalation through channels that convert evidence into enforceable outcomes. My next move wasn't louder confrontation, but professional engagement, bringing in legal and forensic expertise capable of translating the documentation I had assembled into formal analyses that could withstand institutional review rather than neighborhood debate. Specialists in property lineage and compliance verification examined the chain of title from the original deed forward, not searching for dramatic reversals, but identifying procedural vulnerabilities that warranted formal clarification rather than blind reliance on historical consolidation assumptions. Their evaluations confirmed what my initial research suggested, that the quiet title process decades earlier met minimal statutory requirements of its time, yet left open questions about the thoroughness of heir notification and boundary verification under modern standards, emphasizing diligent search rather than limited publication. This distinction mattered enormously because it reframed the dispute from an emotional clash into a legitimate inquiry about whether the jurisdiction Karen exercised had ever been fully stress-tested against the original documentation that predated the HOA's existence. Simultaneously, financial governance specialists reviewed vendor relationships, contract approvals, and budget allocation, not to allege impropriety prematurely, but to assess whether transparency and conflict of interest safeguards aligned with best practices expected of organizations managing shared community funds. Their preliminary observations highlighted areas where procedural clarity could be strengthened, reinforcing the broader narrative that Karen's authority operated within a structure that had never been rigorously audited because it functioned smoothly enough to avoid internal challenge. These expert reviews were not attacks, they were controlled examinations, each report carefully worded to emphasize the need for clarification rather than accusation, a tone that made them far more difficult for Karen to dismiss as personal vendettas. At the same time, regulatory compliance advisors evaluated the grant certifications tied to the community center, analyzing whether the ownership affirmations submitted during funding applications relied on title assumptions that might require reconfirmation if historical boundary questions proved significant. Again, the emphasis remained procedural rather than punitive, focusing on alignment between certified statements and documented lineage rather than implying immediate violations. Yet the mere existence of such evaluations placed Karen in a position where cooperation became the only rational strategy. She could no longer rely on reputation or familiarity with local officials to neutralize concerns that were now framed as technical compliance matters subject to external oversight rather than discretionary neighborhood politics. County administrators, recognizing the growing complexity of the issue, initiated their own archival reviews of permit approvals and planning records, cross-referencing them with historical filings to ensure that development decisions had been based on title documentation that met the standards applied at the time. This layered examination created a convergence of scrutiny from multiple professional perspectives: legal, financial, regulatory, each operating independently, yet reinforcing the same core question about the certainty of the land lineage supporting the HOA's authority. Karen's response shifted noticeably during this phase, her statements becoming measured, cooperative, and carefully framed around transparency and willingness to provide documentation. a stark contrast to the absolute certainty she displayed on my porch weeks earlier. She remained president, she still chaired meetings, but the tone of those meetings transformed, with independent auditors presenting summaries, compliance advisors outlining procedural recommendations, and board members acknowledging the importance of strengthening governance safeguards to restore confidence among residents now aware of the broader review underway. Maria's situation became a focal example during these discussions, not as an accusation, but as a case study illustrating how rigid enforcement of aesthetic rules could produce disproportionate hardship when applied without contextual flexibility. Under guidance from the new advisory reviews, her fines were reassessed through a hardship accommodation framework that recognized medical necessity as a legitimate factor in enforcement decisions, leading to the withdrawal of the lien that had threatened her home and the formal acknowledgement that community standards must balance uniformity with compassion to maintain legitimacy. That outcome, achieved through structured review rather than emotional confrontation, reinforced the principle guiding my entire approach, that dismantling flawed authority structures requires expertise and patience rather than impulsive retaliation that can be reframed as personal grievance. Meanwhile, the title clarification process moved steadily toward judicial review, with expert reports submitted to establish a factual basis for determining whether the original consolidation had sufficiently extinguished prior claims, or whether negotiated boundary recognition would be required to align historical documentation with current ownership realities. Throughout this period, I maintained strict discipline in communication, avoiding public statements that could be misconstrued as triumphalism, because the objective was never to humiliate Karen personally, but to ensure that the authority she exercised operated within verified legal and ethical boundaries. The true retaliation against her overreach wasn't shouting or threats. It was the quiet imposition of professional scrutiny she could not control, a systematic replacement of assumption with analysis that forced every decision she made to pass through frameworks designed to test rather than automatically affirm her power. As weeks turned into months, the cumulative effect of these expert interventions became unmistakable. Governance reforms were drafted, independent financial disclosures were scheduled, conflict of interest policies were proposed, and procedural guidelines for enforcement actions were rewritten to incorporate oversight mechanisms that would prevent any single leader from exercising unchecked discretion in the future. Karen remained visible, still speaking at meetings, still signing documents, but the aura of unilateral dominance that once defined her presence had been replaced by a constrained role operating within clearly defined boundaries, shaped by external expertise rather than personal authority alone. The retaliation she faced was not dramatic, it was surgical, removing the unquestioned assumptions that had sustained her control and replacing them with verified processes that demanded transparency, accountability, and alignment with the original records she had never thought to examine until the moment she tried to force me off land, whose lineage she had always taken for granted. By the time the final determinations were issued, there was no explosion, no dramatic courtroom revelation, and no theatrical apology from Karen, only a series of measured rulings and governance reforms that quietly but permanently redrew the balance of power she had once treated as unquestionable fact. The title clarification process concluded with formal recognition that the original deed's boundaries required negotiated alignment with subsequent developments, not an erasure of existing homes, but a documented acknowledgement that historical ownership lineage had never been conclusively stress-tested until this dispute forced it into the open. That recognition alone altered everything, because Karen's authority could no longer operate as if it rested on an unquestioned foundation. It now existed within a framework that explicitly acknowledged the original documentation my grandfather had created long before the HOA ever drafted its first rule. The negotiated settlement stabilized current property titles, while affirming protective easements and boundary clarifications that permanently prevented the association from asserting unilateral jurisdiction over the Lakehouse parcel again, transforming what she had treated as discretionary enforcement territory into land legally insulated from her reach. Governance reforms adopted alongside the ruling mandated transparent financial disclosures, independent review of vendor contracts, and formal hardship accommodations to prevent enforcement actions from disregarding medical or personal circumstances like those that had once threatened Maria's home. Karen remained in her role for a time, but the position she occupied after the reforms bore little resemblance to the unchallenged authority she wielded before. Every directive now subject to oversight. Every enforcement decision required to pass through procedures she could not unilaterally bend to her will. Residents who had once avoided eye contact during her patrols now engaged openly in meetings, asking questions about budgets, policies, and compliance reviews with a confidence born from witnessing how documentation and persistence could rebalance a structure that had drifted too far toward unchecked control. Maria's lien was formally cleared, her home secured without penalties, and her case cited in the revised guidelines as an example of why rigid aesthetic enforcement must yield when human necessity is evident. A quiet correction that carried more weight than any symbolic apology ever could. The community center by the shoreline remained standing, still hosting meetings and events, but its symbolism had shifted from a monument of unilateral authority to a reminder that even the most polished structures depend on the integrity of the records supporting their existence. I returned to my workshop not as a victor celebrating conquest, but as a custodian restoring continuity, the drafting table once again holding maps and journals that no longer felt like relics under threat, but like documents that had fulfilled their purpose by forcing clarity where assumption once ruled. The radio I had been repairing when Karen first banged on my door finally came back to life, its signal steady and clear, a quiet metaphor for how systems function when every connection is verified rather than guessed. Outside, the lake remained unchanged, indifferent to the conflict that had unfolded along its shore, and that indifference reinforced the lesson my grandfather embedded in every line he drew, that land endures beyond the egos of those who try to control it, and ultimately answers only to what can be proven, measured, and recorded. Karen no longer knocked on my door, no longer sent notices, and no longer spoke as if her authority extended into spaces defined by records she had never personally examined, because the process she had triggered by trying to remove me had forced her to confront the limits of power built on assumption rather than verified lineage. There was no handshake between us, no reconciliation scene, just a quiet coexistence defined by boundaries now clarified and procedures now constrained, a colder and more enduring resolution than any dramatic confrontation could have produced. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm where rules still existed, but were applied with awareness that enforcement derived legitimacy, not from repetition, but from alignment with documented ownership and transparent governance standards. I spent more evenings in the workshop, restoring tools, cataloging my grandfather's journals, and preserving the very records that had ultimately secured the land. Patient verification. The silence inside that house returned, not as the fragile calm that existed before Karen's first knock, but as a deeper, proven peace, grounded in the knowledge that the land's lineage had been tested and reaffirmed under scrutiny, strong enough to outlast any future challenge. Karen's voice, once sharp and absolute across meetings and driveways, faded into the background noise of routine administration, still present but stripped of the unilateral certainty she once projected with such confidence. In the end, there was no triumphant speech, no declaration of victory, only the steady continuation of life on land whose boundaries had been reasserted through documentation rather than dominance, leaving Karen with a role she could no longer wield as a weapon, and leaving me with the quiet, enduring satisfaction of knowing that the authority she tried to use to remove me had ultimately been constrained by the very records she never thought to read.